1960. It had just passed 7 o'clock in the evening on the 3rd of March 1960 when an aeroplane entered Scottish airspace. A man in his early 30s was wearing a smart US Army suit with greasy, slicked-back black hair. He appeared frantic as he barged into the cockpit, holding his US sergeant's hat in one hand. Both male pilots were immediately alarmed by the man's sudden intrusion. Before they could fume their anger at him, the man abruptly explained why his entrance was out of character. "We have to land," the American man shouted as he appeared out of breath. Once the pilots realized it was Sergeant Richard Cox, they withheld their angry thoughts. Sergeant Cox was in charge of every man on the plane. It was his job to ensure everyone on board landed safely and soundly in New York. "Stop the plane!" Cox shouted again. Both pilots remained silent. Neither wanted to explain that they were still many hours away from descending into the New Jersey Air Force Base. "I needed a doctor like 5 minutes ago," Cox explained, a little calmer this time. One of the pilots gave the sergeant a glaring look as if to say, "I'm flying a plane. Do I look like a doctor to you?" "We're flying above Scotland, sir," the other pilot stated. "Well, what are you waiting for?" Sergeant Cox rhetorically asked. "Get Scottish airspace on the radio and explain we need to land pronto and to make sure they have a doctor waiting on the runway for us." "Yes, sir," the same pilot replied before he began speaking into his headset. As Cox turned to leave the cockpit, another smartly dressed soldier stopped him in his tracks in order to whisper something into his ear. Cox immediately closed his eyes once he comprehended what was being described to him. When the soldier was finished conveying his message, Cox kept his eyes shut for a few more seconds before reopening them and turning his attention back to his pilots. "New plan," he said to both men. The one pilot immediately ceased speaking into his headset as he peered over his shoulder towards the exhausted-looking sergeant. "We're landing to refuel," Cox clarified. "That's all. Don't mention anything about a doctor. Explain that we forgot to refuel in Germany and we require gas to get us to New York." He paused while he waited for a response. "Got it?" "Yes, sir. Stopping to refuel," one of the pilots confirmed. As soon as Cox left the cockpit, the same pilot went back onto his headset to execute the sergeant's orders. Shortly later, the 1950 S-built US aircraft landed on a Scottish runway at around 7:30. When the platform stairs were secured underneath the side entrance of the plane, Sergeant Cox was the first and only person to exit. He had a suggestive expression on his face as he scurried down the stairs before rushing towards the terminal. The building itself looked more like a hotel, with its orange-pitched roof and white-rendered facade, compared with how modern airports now resembled. Once inside, he offered a $10 bill to the first person he saw in exchange for some British coins. The airport worker never hesitated for a second, as he appeared thrilled to shake on such a deal. With his handful of coins, Sergeant Cox entered the classic British red phone box outside the airport's front entrance. After he slotted some coins into the phone booth, he dialed the number he wanted to call, along with the American dialing code. He stood still as his call began to ring out. "Colonel Parker," Cox said into the handset as the ringing tone turned to dead air. "Sorry to phone you so early. It's Sergeant Cox," he said before he was abruptly interrupted. He patiently stood inside the phone booth for over a minute, listening to every word the other man had to say. "I'm sorry, Colonel, but we have a slight problem." As soon as Cox exited the red phone box, his face was as white as a ghost. He removed a packet of cigarettes from his uniform jacket pocket. He looked up at the night sky as he placed a ciggy on his lower lip. Without taking his eyes off the sky, he placed the packet into his left trouser pocket before removing a packet of matches from his right pocket. He lit the cigarette resting on his lip and inhaled before finally blowing the smoke above his head into the night sky. Cox was so distracted by his own dilemma that he hadn't noticed the unusual rowdy crowd of women power-walking his way from the far side of the car park. It wasn't until a taxi rolled up in front of him and an over-exuberant woman exited that his predicament gradually got worse. As Cox took another drag of his cigarette, he casually waved his other hand in the taxi driver's direction before approaching the car. It was at that moment that the young, pretty woman noticed Cox's smart but uncommon US Army uniform. "Is it true?" she excitedly asked him. "Is the king of rock and roll in Scotland?" He studied her face while his right hand, holding the cigarette between his fingers, lingered inches in front of his mouth. "Just don't get your hopes up, miss." Elvis isn't quite feeling his usual self at the moment. The woman's jaw immediately dropped. "Ma'am," Cox said as he removed his army cap from his head before giving the woman a quick curtsy. He never hung around long enough to witness the large crowd of women as they descended into the terminal building. As soon as he was inside the taxi, he demanded that the driver drive him to the nearest bar. The driver dropped him off at the most popular bar that Prestwick could possibly offer an overseas army sergeant. The bar was fairly busy, considering it was a Wednesday evening. Most of the drinkers were men who had arrived straight from work, but some couples were all dolled up for date night. The bar was more like a lounge, with all the small round tables scattered around, in between the bar and the small stage. Cox wasn't much of a whiskey drinker, but was in Scotland, so he might as well blend in. He sat by himself on a bar stool with his back to the stage, while he contemplated life as Colonel Parker's words remained echoing in his head. He was ready to order one final drink before returning to face the music, when the lights inside the room suddenly dimmed. Then, a song he was far too acquainted with began to play throughout the room. It was as if someone was playing tricks with the sergeant when a familiar voice started singing about how they went to a party at a county jail. He turned around to find Elvis singing and dancing on the small stage. The more he watched the man jitter his knees from one side to the next, he realized it wasn't the actual Elvis. But there was a moment when he genuinely thought the king of rock and roll was up on that stage. That's how good his impersonation was. Once the Elvis on stage had finished singing Jailhouse Rock, he began speaking to his audience while remaining in character. By now, Cox had returned to facing his back to the stage in order to enjoy his whiskey in peace. But even he was impressed by the way he verbally portrayed the most famous man on the planet. Even his visual depiction wasn't far from it. He wore black and white shoes, pressed black trousers, an oversized grey blazer, and a shiny gold shirt, not to mention the classic exposed white socks. His hair wasn't quite as shiny as the real Elvis's, and his skin was nowhere near as tanned, but other than that, he had done a fine job representing the king of rock and roll. It wasn't just Cox who thought so. Plenty of people were now on their feet, dancing around the small tables. Halfway through the song, Hound Dog, Cox began to worry as he anxiously stared at his watch. The plane would have been refueled by now, and everyone would be wondering where he was. Was there a possibility that they would leave without him? He drank the rest of his whiskey just as the Elvis on stage finished the song and disappeared out of the room. Cox went into his pocket for his cigarettes and lit one up using his matches. He gave the barman a $10 bill, followed by a cheeky wink. It wasn't until Cox stepped outside into the fresh evening cool air that the effects of those whiskeys finally hit him. He might have felt tipsy, but his troubles weren't going away anytime soon. As he smoked his ciggy on the pavement outside the bar, he searched the Scottish streets for a taxi when he caught sight of the Elvis impersonator. He was standing, resting his back against the external wall of the bar, smoking and acquiring some well-earned fresh air from all that singing and dancing he performed on stage. Not even the cool breeze in the air could do anything about that fact, and he remained drenched in perspiration. It then suddenly hit Cox like a ton of bricks. This man could solve all his problems. The sergeant was a desperate man who would do anything to avoid his family being harmed by the powerful Colonel Parker, Elvis Presley's long-term manager. The Elvis impersonator was only 10 yards away from him, who, by now, was staring straight back at him because Cox hadn't bothered to redirect any of his blatant stares. "Are you an American?" the Elvis asked in a thick Scottish accent. Cox's chin dropped as he continued to stare at him. "Your Elvis impression on stage was uncanny." "Thank you," he replied in his Elvis voice. "Thank you very much." Cox began smiling while breathing rather loudly, as if he was either going to burst out laughing or sneeze. "How would you like to meet the real Elvis?" he asked the man. "So, the rumors are true?" the Elvis asked in his Scottish dialect. Sergeant Cox then spotted a taxi coming his way and instantaneously threw his hand in the air to flag it down. When the taxi stopped, Cox opened one of its doors before glancing back at the man. "It's now or never." A bright grin appeared on the Elvis's face as he rushed over to enter the back seat of the taxi. Once the man was inside, Cox flicked what was left of his cigarette towards the bar before following him inside the taxi. Cox explained to the Scotsman that in order for him to meet the king of rock and roll, he had to first do a favor for Elvis. It involved him switching outfits with Cox before playing the performance of his life by greeting a few of Elvis's fans at the airport. As they arrived at the airport, they soon realized it wasn't just a few fans that had shown up to see the most famous man on earth, but there were upwards of 200 people there waiting to greet him. Within seconds of being spotted outside the terminal building, the masses of Elvis's fans, male and female, were screaming their heads off. He wore the US Army uniform, while Cox wore Elvis's sweaty outfit. Cox had given him some advice beforehand, such as smiling, signing some autographs, and saying very little. Cox remained lingering by his side the entire time, making sure he stayed in character. There were a few stutters in his accent, and they became more frequent the further the charade went on. Each time, a hint of a Scottish dialect slipped out. Cox ground his teeth together. All it would take was one fan to spot the discrepancies, and the entire place would be in turmoil. There was even a photographer there to mark such an occasion as this, Elvis's first time on British soil. This wasn't Cox's first rodeo with Elvis's legions of fans, and hopefully it wouldn't be the last. After spending at least a few seconds with each of his adoring fans, it was time for them both to get on the plane. Elvis waved a final goodbye to the Scottish people. He appeared to be loving every second of the attention. As soon as Cox, followed by the Scottish Elvis, entered the aeroplane, he took him straight to the cockpit, where he asked the pilots for some alone time with the king of rock and roll. When the pilots left, both men sat on their seats. "What's going on?" Elvis asked in his broad Scottish accent. "Why did you just refer to me as the king of rock and roll?" Cox looked out the front of the aeroplane and into the night sky, where he had the perfect view of the waning crescent moon. "How badly do you wish you were the real king of rock and roll?" Cox asked as he remained focused on the moon. "I love, He was abruptly interrupted by Cox, who had turned his neck to face the Scotsman. "I want to only hear you speak in Elvis's voice." He gave Cox a puzzled look. "I love Elvis Presley," he stated, just as Cox had requested. "Do you love his music?" "I only wish I was the one to have written it," he said in his broken Elvis impersonation, as his Scotland twang could be heard sneaking out. "Your Elvis accent was perfect at the bar earlier," Cox said, lecturing him. "What is that all about?" Elvis immediately dropped his face into his hands as he began sobbing. "I'm a fraud. I can only perform if I have Valium in my system," he said in his Scotland accent. "I don't have the self-confidence to sing, dance, and speak like him without it." Cox placed his arm around his shoulder. "Don't you worry about that. I'll get you all the Valium in the world, if that's what it takes for you to be Elvis." "You want me to be Elvis?" he asked as he raised his head, speaking in his impersonation. "The Elvis? I thought you said the real Elvis was on this plane, and I was going to meet him." "He is," Cox explained. "He's inside a body bag at the end of this very plane." In the end, he didn't bother to listen to his heart. But he isn't Elvis anymore. "You are." He gave Cox that same puzzled look as before. "The world needs an Elvis Presley," Cox explained as he patted him on his back. "We'll be in the States in 12 hours, where all your fans will be dying to meet you." Sergeant Cox stood up and walked out of the cockpit.